Okay. It's live on YouTube now, so I guess we can start. Okay, wait. Okay, I've been told to wait. Sorry. Okay, now I can start. Okay, so hello everyone who might be watching on YouTube and also all the panel members here. So happy to have everyone here, and yeah, I just also it's World Environment Day, so whether it's a happy World Environment Day or a sad World Environment Day, just want to wish everyone. My name is Sanjana. I'm a volunteer at Fridays for Future, and I'm so excited to be able to speak with such a diverse panel and hear from them and learn from them. Maybe I can start first by kind of introducing the speakers who are here, and then we can go ahead. And each speaker can speak, for maybe 10 to 15 minutes. And if we have any questions, we can, talk about that at the end. So yeah, so we have on the panel Chaitanya, who has joined as a program associate at the Asian Development Research Institute, and is part of the Program Management Unit on Air Quality Management at the Center for Environment, Energy and Climate Change. Currently, he's working with the Bihar State Pollution Control Board for the implementation of the NCAAP. He's a point of contact for Greenpeace India's public engagement program for 5 states in the West Zone of India. As a part of the programs, he has supported Greenpeace in many national and international campaigns. Prior to Greenpeace, Chaitanya provided program management support to various NGOs like Odisha Calling Foundation, Samya Gram Vikas Sanstha, etc. And as his bio says, he's one of the few climate advocates hailing from a marginalized background in India, the groups that tend to be most affected and least consulted in the climate movement. He holds a master's degree in climate change and sustainability from the Tata Institute of Social Sciences, and his interest lies in the field of climate change mitigation and adaptation within the purview of social justice. Next, we have Arpita Kodiveri, who is a Hans Kelsen Fellow and doctoral researcher in law and at the European University Institute. Her research examines land conflicts and legal mobilization by forest-dwelling communities in the mining areas of Odisha, India. She had previously worked as an environmental lawyer supporting forest-dwelling communities in their struggle to assert their forest rights. She has an LLM from UC Berkeley as a Fulbright Nehru Fellow and a BS LLB from ILS Law College, Pune. We also have Prakash Kashwan, who is an associate professor of political science and co-director of research program on economic and social rights, Human Rights Institute, University of Connecticut Stores. He's an author of the widely reviewed and acclaimed book, Democracy in the Woods, Environmental Conservation and Social Justice in India, Tanzania, and Mexico, and a co-editor of the journal Environmental Politics. He's a member of the Global Expert Group of Scoping of Transformative Change, Assessment by Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, a member of Academic Working Group, AWG, on International Governance of Climate Engineering, a senior fellow of the Earth System Governance Project, and a member of Climate Social Science Network, convened by Brown University. We also have Disha Ravi on the panel, who's a 22-year-old climate and social activist from Bangalore, India, and she's a volunteer with Fridays for Future India as well. So thank you all for being here. Yeah, so I think we can start. Maybe Arpita can start I can hand over the mic and Arpita can start. Yeah, sure.
Thank you so much, Sanjana, and thank you to Fridays for the Future for putting together this really exciting panel. And on a topic that's something that needs to be discussed more openly. And it's great to have a platform to kind of trigger those ideas and thought processes. So a lot of my work has been on trying to examine how is it that lawyers could come into spaces where environmental issues are being experienced and alleviate some of that. So how do we look at the law as a source of healing, right, in these kinds of conflicts? And intersectionality as a formally trained lawyer is something that we don't encounter in law school. It's something that really hits you head on when you're in the ground practicing and working with Adivasi communities and forest dwelling communities, which are groups that I've largely worked with. And the question that you start to ask then is, what is the ability of the law, particularly the environmental legal framework, to even address some of these intersectional issues? whether it is a question of land rights of Adivasi communities, which I'm sure Prakash will speak to a lot more, or whether it's the issue of caste-based discrimination, which is kind of resulting in certain kinds of outcomes for these communities, whether they're more confronting the issues of pollution more closely. And environmental justice becomes that one idea or concept where you feel like you can start to see some semblance of the role of law in a more just framework. And environmental justice itself is an evolving idea. So I don't want to kind of, cement what that concept really is. But I think I want to spend my sort of 10 minutes really speaking to lawyering itself, right? Firstly, who are lawyers and why do they come into these sites of conflict? What do they do and how do they do it? Um, Lawyers are a very particular breed. They've been trained to sort of represent people and communities who are in a conflict situation, which can range from family disputes to property disputes. But in the environmental conflict context, what starts happening is the communities are facing injustices, and these communities are largely marginalized. And as a lawyer, when you step in, very often you are upper caste, you tend to be from an urban area. What is then the ethics of engagement between the lawyer and the client, right? Firstly, we need to break that framework of lawyer and client. It's about lawyers tend to also be trained to be morally in a very neutral zone because we are trained that we have to represent any client who comes to us. So then you have to shift gears to looking at what lawyering for communities might be. And in that process, as you start to work with communities on the ground and you understand their notions and ideas of justice and find a way through which the law can come and aid in that process, itself is really transformative. And that kind of lawyering itself by default has to be intersectional because these communities are diverse themselves. They have diverse ideas of what justice means, and to build consensus and to work from there. And also lawyering in some senses, creates a gatekeeper approach. So the lawyer kind of becomes that specialist who can use the law. But when in reality, and I was listening to Priya Pillai in the previous discussion, where she alluded to how communities facing injustices are very clever and know how to build these strategies, whether they're rural communities or urban ones. So it's about surrendering the law's interpretation and the use of law to these communities. So how do we kind of work from the bottom up in that sense? And also to kind of break the barriers of who can use the law, right? One of the amazing things with the CAA protests when they were alive and active, and there's a lovely piece by Aditya in Kafila, where he talks about the fact that citizens took ownership of interpretation of the law and the Constitution. And then they communicated back to the specialist legislators saying, this particular piece of legislation is unconstitutional. And environmental movements in India have been successful in really using the law. Granted, the implementation has been a big issue, but one of the things they've really achieved is they've drafted laws, they've changed the way laws get interpreted, and they've also managed to infuse the law with a lot of ideas of environmental justice. But then again, the law has its limitations. So that's the other thing. So how does a lawyer in this space be humble about the law's ability to heal these conflicts? I just want to quickly conclude by saying that it's, the law is not only the territory of lawyers, which is something I've already alluded to earlier, but that the idea of building legal strategies and when to call upon the law is a very, very delicate process. And that is again, a very intersectional process. So if you have all environmental struggles are political, right? They're political, they're economic, they're social. What does bringing in the law in a very political struggle mean? Is it going to make a political problem into a legal one and dilute the radical possibilities of that political movement? Or is it going to support that political struggle? And who gets to make those decisions, right? the trajectory of the way these legal strategies have been built has been sadly top down. So it's the lawyers kind of saying, this is what we should do, and this is how we should approach it. Whereas if it was the other way around, to the extent where these strategies of even not using the law, or the idea that we shouldn't go to court, we should instead be going to another forum for a redressal. Because the kind of impact using the law has on communities is quite adverse as well. So in the areas that I did fieldwork, say where the POSCO plant was being built in Jagat Singhpur in Orissa, when they started to use the law, the police the whole community was criminalized under a whole host of provisions of the UAPA, etc. And that was an immediate response to legal mobilization. So what then is the impact of going to the court, and how does that impact the communities on the front line? And this issue of environmental defenders is a completely important one, which we've not yet gotten to, but I'll just wrap it up with that. So those are my 2 cents to this problem.
Thank you so much for sharing. I think there's a lot of things that I have to think about, a lot of interesting thought fodder, I guess. Now I think we can move on to Chaitanya. Would like to go ahead.
Thank you. Am I audible? Okay. Thank you, Arpita, for that insightful experience sharing of your work and lawyering per se. Yeah, I want to start with some of the basic definitions, starting from what is environment and how it goes to intersectionality to leading to environmental justice. Because I think my topic, the theme I chose to speak today is very much related to basics of the terminologies that we use and the narratives that are used in the environmental movement across the world or India in specific. So when you talk about environment, it just means the basic and the simplest definition is everything that surrounds us. So that includes people plus flora and fauna, air, water, land, and other atmospheric and chemical combinations with the physical and non-living environment. So that is the basic crust of what environment means. So people tend to forget that they are also a part of environment per se. It's not just the flora, fauna, and the land, water, or the landscapes are there, various environmental landscapes. But the people as a constituent and the biggest part, because of the which interaction, then these all constituents having interaction together makes what it is called as ecology. The relationship between living beings and non-living beings in their physical environment. And the area all this interaction happens is what we called as ecosystem or an environment. So when let's talk about now environmentalism per se. So environmentalism is a very broad ideology or a social movement we can call it, which encompasses and mainly focus on environmental protection and also which deals with the improvement of the health of the environment. When I'm saying health of the environment, this is Wikipedia definition I took off. So they mean the health aspects of the constituent that are used. That may be animals, species, natural components, and all the other factors, even non-living factors, say landslides and all. So all this encompasses, and the movement to strive to perfection and to save all these things from degradation is what we normally can call environmentalism. So now I want to touch base upon the pertinent factor that is missing in the environmental justice movement or environmentalism per se. I will not say environmental justice. Let's get back to you that latter. So what is happening currently in the environmental movement right now? The current environmental movement, as mainstream movement, we would call it, is centered around the saving aspects of non-living aspects of environment, per se land, water, air, and such things. And it is not centered around the people who cohabitate and their physical activity that goes along with it. So this has been put forward, and then the ecology that we can call, which deals around with sociology of people, social ecology, and environmentalism, that combines and make it a ecology. So in the broader construct, international concept, then I will say that what is the lagging in this environmental movement. So if you can see the Western or the what we can see the popular quote unquote environment justice movement or environmentalism that is happening, it is white dominated. And when we look it into Indian context, I will say it is mostly upper caste, upper class, Savarna dominated sphere, where you can't find marginalized tribal or vulnerable community per se in that space at all. Like there are many Dalit activists, and this is the very funny thing. This is very, you should wonder on this. Whenever you see any article, news, narrative, wherever, maybe print, electronic, or even discussion, this term Dalit jo hai, this is not discussed at all. So whenever we talk about the affected people of climate change, disasters, or extreme events, it has always been said that tribals, fishermen communities, and the vulnerable communities or poor or ultra poor. Dalit as a community in India, which is the most oppressed community according to the social hierarchy of Indian society, is not even taken up in those narratives. That word is completely neglected and denied. So when we talk about the intersectionality, now let's say what is intersectionality. So when we talk about intersectionalities, a person may have various social, political, economic categories or labels that he can associate it with. Example, one person can be of middle class, upper caste. Then there are various categories that we put all these into it, like class, race, gender, ethnicity, caste, region, religion, disability, sexuality, and race. So all these identities with having one person have an effect to whatever the spaces that they are in. And overlapping of these identities of a person, individual or group of individuals into each other is what constitutes a framework which deals how the operation or the privilege works within those communities. So this is the basic definition of intersectionalities. So in terms of environmentalism, when we talk about intersectionalities, how it plays, so say a urban woman might face the problems of say pollution, waste management, and water crisis per se. But at the same time, when we talk about climate crisis in the rural context, rural India context, the rural woman might face the same problems with added operation of agriculture crisis and the labor that goes with it. So these are the multi-layered operation that if you say a Dalit woman has to go, so she goes through a triple rail of operation, just class, caste, and gender, that a Savarna woman may not go through, or they are unhindered too. So here I want to talk about this aspect of denial of caste in the environmentalism spaces or environment activism spaces. So as far as my research and my knowledge, there are people coming from marginalized communities, say tribal communities and Dalit communities, are gotten into the environmental space, say research, advocacy, and policy. But as far as my knowledge, there are not many Dalit activists per se. And it saddened me to say that last year when UNDP volunteers had a conference or something, they had to call me because they couldn't find any Dalit activist per se in India. Now, I don't want to call myself a Dalit activist. I call myself and put it in my bio as an Ambedkarite activist. But this is the sad state of affairs that we are into in. Being my presence from 2009 or 2013 in the climate change campaigns and the whole movement, I couldn't find many of the Dalit people or marginalized people that I can associate with and tell my problems around with. So this is very pertaining. And when we talk about Dalits, what are Dalits? So Dalits are the most oppressed community, as I said, according to social hierarchy of Indian society. And their existence is also been cited by the Hindu terminology or society as pollution. So Dalits are so in the Chatur Varna system, there are 4 Varnas: Brahman, Kshatriya, Vaishya, and Shudra. So Shudras are the OBCs, who do the labor work, and Atishudras, who are not in the Chatuvarna system or outside of the Chatuvarna system, are what we call Dalits or untouchable. So it's a cohort term, it's a basic collective term that is used for the untouchables, that is not just involves SCs, but also the tribal communities time to time. So there is an interconnection that goes along in this term, and the terminologies are various. So we can say they divert to each other. So when we talk about purity pollution, that these untouchables are not allowed to even cast their shadow on an upper caste person. So that may be from any of the three varnas or even the fourth. And if that happens, these three people can get polluted. So this is purity parity concept that is very much better explained by Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar in his Annihilation of Caste. If you can read, this would be a reading for most of the viewers. So you can go through that. And when it comes to Indian environmental spaces or activism, I would say that it is dominated by, you see, upper caste, upper class Savarna folks. And diversity की बात आती है, it's okay if I speak in Hindi. I think most of the people would be. To include the diversification factors, we talk about tribal women or tribal men. But then there is still completely, shockingly, we can say that no mention of any of the Dalit perspective at all in this moment. And this is much, and there is always this criticism that happens on Dalit community that why they are alienated or they dislike environmentalists per se, which is actually true in some sense. But because of the factor that when we say people have their right to claim of humanity, the Dalit community or the untouchable community in India is still fighting for the social status equality, which can be taken into consideration, which then lead to called as equal to other human beings. So when we talk about environmental movements, most of the people won't, most even I'm from the community itself, and my community people are not aware that when Babasaheb Ambedkar did this protest against Brahmins by drinking water at Saudar Pond in Mahad, it was we can say that it was the first environmental movement. Before that, also Buddha and Mahavir Jain also had these similar movements to break the shackles of inequality and oppression by the means of getting access to the natural resources, which are the untouchables are denied of. So Gail Ahmed says that in her speech or an article that she had produced in 1997, I guess, that access to resource is denied. So how can you accept or expect from the community that they will fight for the resources and there's what we can say their protection? The very basic thing that this community is kept aside of all the resources to accessing it, and then you try to accept and ask them to criticize why you are not aligning in the movement of environmental protection. And that is why I think the reason that environmental protection movement and anti-caste movement are going parallelly but not together is the same reason that this discrimination that has been internalized by the society on the virtue of caste distinction is separating them and alienating them from the main discourse that should be there, that collectively we need to fight this thing together. Now, I have some very much examples, but I will not cite them. Also in the context that what I want to present myself here as, like Greta Thunberg is doing great job, but there are various people from sub-Saharan Africa, African countries, and other marginalized indigenous groups. These activists didn't get the same exposure that they should have gotten. Like Autumn Pelter, and then there is this girl, there's this woman, Daphne Fries, and also the various sub-Saharan people, like I have named some of you, like Nimo Basi. Now, he has started his activism in late 90s. And I don't know if the people are in the academic spaces or in activism spaces know about these people. per se Vanessa Nakate and also uh, Ayaka Maltifafa. So these are the people who are from this indigenous committee and doing such a great thing. Like they started their own environmental replenishment, something ERA is the organization name, ERA, you can Google it. I don't know correctly the name. And also Young People for the Future Africa. So these are the organizations that these people have started and they are not gotten any of the attention that they might need. And coming to the point that why I think this is necessary, because these are the community who, in the event of extreme event or disaster, are the worst affected. Given that the social discrimination, racial discrimination, which then hinders their income per se to build resilience against anything such happens, and also to their livelihood and earnings. So when these people like Vic Barrett is standing and suing US government, uh, one department actually, one of the 21st, they are claiming these spaces and saying that, okay, although it is white dominated spaces, but we also want to do, and we also want to put our voice. That is what we are standing in this moment. And then there is this notion that comes up in the environmentalism of environmental justice, which is access to environmental resources, say clean air, clean water, safe food, to everyone equally, irrespective of their caste, race, gender, class, ethnicity, sexuality, their behavior, and there's other, what we can say, other categories, is what we called as environmental justice movement. And as those people stand in between and raise their voice, here I am raising my voice in this, what we can say, UC Savarna dominated space of environmental activism, and putting my voice for the communities of, say, queer communities, Muslim, ethnic minorities, and specifically, since I'm coming from a Dalit community, putting my voice as an Ambedkarite environmentalist in this space. Lastly, to wrap this up, I will say that there are laws in place in a constitution, like Indian constitution previously, article 21, 42, 47, 49, and the current, the present constitution articles like 48A, 51A, 39B, 39C. These are the articles that constitutes and safeguards the communities, vulnerable communities, from all these disaster and risks. But when we see the recent Kerala floods, and even in last year and last to last year, since 2018, these are rampant news that are coming. The most affected communities of climate disasters like floods and cyclones don't even get the relief material that they need after to build their resilience after affected by these climate extreme events, because of their social location and the discrimination that happen over their social location. So this is what we are, and I think we need to talk more about it. We need to bring more voices from these communities and build a collective workforce to work upon this. Because, and then it will, what we say, that climate justice can't be happening without social justice. But yes, first we need to start bringing those social justice aspect, and then we can talk about climate justice. At least for Indian communities, it is the only way to go. So let's see that how that happens. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Chaitanya. I think there's a lot of things that you pointed out that as young climate movements and as young climate activists, we should also take the time to learn, and, you know, a lot of lessons that we should probably try to bring about a change in the scenario. Next, we can move to Disha. Would you like to go?
Yeah, I think, Chaitanya, you raised a lot of very, very valid points, especially about casteism within the movement and even outside the movement. And I think this is also something as FF, like I'm going to talk about how we address some of these issues. So even though we did start out with a lot of people from the VBA community, it was still the majority of people in FFF India, at least, were upper caste people, like you mentioned. And we recognized that this is a problem. And what we initially did was we started off with learning more about how to be better allies and how to be supportive to the DBA community. And after that, we opened up because we didn't want to go in and reach out to other, even though we had like people within the community in the movement, we opened up, we started working with Adivasi Lives Matter, but even before we started that, we wanted to be mindful of where we will draw the line at tokenizing them, or where we will draw the line at collaboration or partnership. And that's when we essentially started our work out, at least to some extent, to make the movement less upper caste. And we worked with Adivasi Lives Matter first, and even then now, I'm very happy to say that we have like an FF Jharkhand chapter, which was started by fully Adivasi youth, and there's FF Tapuskar, which also has a lot of Adivasi youth. So we this is not like a defense. I'm just saying how we address the problem. So we also have a caste and climate justice playlist on at the FF India YouTube, which was conducted, and we invited a lot of panelists on how to both educate ourselves on how the upper caste people in the movement can be better allies, as well as how to make sure that we aren't taking up space as a movement without giving a platform to those most impacted. So we hope we'll continue addressing this issue because it's definitely not solved, and it's not gonna be solved overnight. This is a continuous process that we hope to keep addressing, and we hope to make it more inclusive and non-exclusive. Ignore that. But yeah, we hope to make it more inclusive. And another thing that we did on an international level was, as India, or like you mentioned, because so many global South countries aren't given the recognition they deserve, especially activists from these countries. Like Vanessa is my friend, and like Daphne is a friend. And I know these people, and these people have been working for a really long time without getting the same recognition, say Greta, who is white in comparison. And which is why even in the movement, there was, as FF International, there was a lot of colonial practices, and it exists even today, which is something we really wanted to address. And we also wanted to stop using the term like Global South. So what we did was we started another group altogether. It's called MAPA, which is Most Affected People in Areas. This was initially started as an alternative name to Global South, because Global South emphasized a lot on like the monetary value of these countries. And we wanted to move away from that and highlight the impacts that the people from essentially the Global South have to experience, because due to which MAPA was termed. And it took us a while to understand that even in MAPA countries, that there are a few privileged people who will never be impacted with the by the climate crisis. Like say, like in India's case, an upper caste person who is fairly privileged, upper class, will not be impacted by the climate crisis, even though they live in India. They might probably breathe bad air, but they have the resources to make sure that they can come out of the situation to some extent. And that's something we wanted to take cognizance of. And so now, MAPA works on making sure that even in the Global South, the countries and the communities in the Global South who are most impacted are given platform. And we wanted to make sure that MAPA is a term that is used in alternative to Global South, and it is being used. The UN uses it now to some extent. We worked with UNICEF, and they use MAPA now. So what we essentially wanted to do with MAPA was, A, change climate conversations around how people from marginalized communities are viewed, and B, make sure that people most impacted are at the forefront of climate decisions and negotiations. And I know we have a very long way to go, but I hope that we will be able to continuously work to ensure that the BDA community as is represented in international conversations and activists from the most impacted regions are given a platform, because there is no point, like you said very rightfully, that there's no point in environmental justice if there's no social justice. That's essentially what I want to say. Thank you.
Thank you, Disha. Yeah, I think we can now move on to Dr. Prakash and yeah, just hear what he has to say.
Thank you, everybody. Really honored to be part of this inspiring panel. And thanks to all of my fellow panelists for such wonderful comments. I want to start by paying tribute to lakhs of people who have lost lives, and tens of lakhs of people and their families who have struggled through the COVID crisis for no fault of that. This will be a long fight, even as things are getting slightly better in urban areas. It's just getting started in some rural areas. So I think we will be keeping India and people in our thoughts and prayers. Second, I also want to recognize and sort of bring up the detainment of Hidme Markham, who's an Adivasi activist who was violently taken away, arrested illegally, and is being confined without there being any reasonable charges against her. And I hope that after this conversation, some of us can actually write a petition, and we can sort of collect public support for raising awareness for Hidme's work and the tortures that she's being subjected to. So with that, and one more sort of preface comments, that before I got into academia in 2005, I had another career in international development, worked with NGOs and social movements. And so it makes me particularly happy when I sit along with young activists who are now engaged in social struggles and economic justice issues. So that makes me, I am young, but it makes me feel even younger. I want to start by something that Chaitanya mentioned about the definition of environment. And he did a great job of sort of outlining all of the different elements of environmental justice and intersectionality. One thing that I would like to add to that discussion is that the environmental justice movement in the US and elsewhere, they redefined environment from focusing on pristine nature spaces and the national parks and sanctuaries that you drive over to over the weekend, to think about environment as something where we, as in marginalized communities, live, work, and play. Right? So environment should be a space of well-being and thriving communities and people, and the tendency within the environmental movement, global north, but also increasingly in other parts of the world, has been to sort of focus on, let's protect the wildlife, let's protect the trees and biodiversity and conservation. All of that is important, especially because protection of biodiversity is central to the protections of cultures and ways of life and livelihoods of the marginalized people. So intersectionality is a really powerful framework that draws our attention to the intersection of not just different identities and disadvantages, but also how those different identities intersect with the environment itself. Right? And so if the environmental movement or environmental activists continue to sort of define or describe an environment in the form of polar bears and tigers and pandas, you can see how it leaves an entire world out of the purview of the environment, as Chaitanya rightly pointed out. So the first thing that I want to emphasize is that making, I'm in my backyard and there are some noises here. Making environmental movement inclusive should start by redefining environment and rethinking how we think about, conceptualize, operationalize, and talk about the environment. So it's not just that, there is a environmental conversation and, Dalits and Adivasis have been out of that conversation that we can now readily bring into this conversation. We have to change the conversation itself. We have to change the vocabulary, the arguments, the logics, all of that. So as Chaitanya did a great job of sort of laying out the entire argument about Dalits and how Dalits have been left out of the environmental discourse, how in Indian context, if we don't talk about the sanitation system, how our municipal sanitation systems are organized on the backs of oppressive, inhuman employment of Dalits as Safai Karamcharis, we will never get our environmentalism right. So these are the kinds of questions that we should be bringing into these conversations, and I'm thankful to Fridays for Future for starting this conversation where we are already sort of beginning to sort of grapple with some of these challenges. The second thing I want to sort of highlight is that as you know, if some of you are coming, some as an audience, if some of you are hearing about intersectionality and this new definition of environment for the first time, you will realize that there are many layers to the environmental debate that sometimes have not been explored adequately. Right? So, and that's just the beginning. There are so many complications. Imagine an entire sort of big onion, and you're sort of peeling one layer at a time, and you're discovering new facets. So, for all of us who work in the environment space, and especially those of us who have the goals of bringing questions of social justice into environmental conversation, we should have the patience to engage with one another. And sometimes academics who have spent decades on these questions, they don't spend enough time sort of laying out the nuts and bolts of these kinds of issues and discussions. For example, even as intersectionality is coming into discussion, there's already a 15 to 20 year long scholarly literature on intersectionality, which shows that intersectionality has focused too much on certain aspects of intersectionality, like African American women being part of the injustices, multiple injustices. That has become a very common argument in intersectionality. In the context of climate crisis and climate justice, I would argue that it's more important to think about the privileges and how those privileges intersect with and contribute to climate crisis. Because it's important to organize, mobilize, talk to one another among marginalized communities, but climate crisis will not be solved until we have actually addressed the problem of vulgar consumption, right? Profligate, extreme consumption. So you have one billionaire flying their chartered plane throughout the world, and that contributes more emissions than an entire state in India does throughout the year, right? And so I think getting a sense of the proportionate contribution to the environmental problem, to the climate crisis, is extremely important for the justice argument. And it's also exactly important for solving the climate problem, right? So this also reminds us that solving the climate crisis is not one thing and climate justice is not another thing, right? They're joint at birth. If we did not have the power, the absolute unaccountable, vulgar power that the fossil fuel corporations enjoy in the global political economy, we wouldn't have had the climate crisis, because we knew in the late 60s, not in the 90s, not in the 80s, we knew in the late 1960s, the fossil fuel corporations' internal research was showing that we are going to cause climate crisis. So it's only through their power and they're working with political and economic elites in the global South, making note of Disha's point about global South, only through these inter-elite power plays, we have ended up here. So I would, make a submission that while we mobilize, while we talk to one another, let's stay focused on calling out the elite and the rich and the wealthy who contribute to the climate crisis. As I'm sure all of you have seen those statistics, the richest 10% have contributed more than the bottom 70% of the world population to climate crisis. Right. So there's, I think this keeping in mind that the rich and the wealthy are really responsible for this, and they have to be forced to change their lifestyles, to change the way they extract and exploit both human and natural communities is extremely important. The last point I would like to sort of mention, and then we can get into a Q&A, is that, coming back to how we need to define and rethink the way we think about environment, and then you can talk about climate crisis, the weather patterns, climate patterns, all of these complications. Coming from the West, there's a great deal of faith in rational argumentation. This idea that let's lay out the science, let's, talk about how climate crisis has caused this particular intensity of storm, of hurricane or floods, and that will actually motivate the public and the policymakers to act. The evidence, and I'm talking about hard scientific evidence, the evidence that we have from past 3 decades at least shows us that this faith in science and this faith in sort of laying out the information and urging the policymakers to act, it's completely misplaced. And I mean, this is a very complex topic, so I don't want to get into another sort of discussion about scientific uncertainty. There was a conversation on the Twitter space other day where we talked a little bit about that. But remember, climate crisis is a political problem. Fundamentally, it's a political problem. If you are getting into this game of trying to convince the public, it's important to do that. But please remember that focusing on the powerful economic and political elites and forcing them to act without waiting for this multi-decadal program of public awareness is extremely important, because we are already in the midst of the climate crisis. Poor communities are paying the price of climate crisis on a day in and day out basis. 40 million people, which is like 4 crore people in Bihar, Uttar Pradesh, Nepal, and Bangladesh were displaced because of the floods in 2017. The Indian media nearly didn't talk enough about this. And that's because, as Chaitanya and Arpita and everybody pointed out, climate crisis, even in India and even in many of the poorest countries in Africa, is not affecting the elite in the same way as it is affecting the poorest people. And it's because of the imbalances in how media, academia, culture, music, television, films are dominated by elite, upper middle class people, that we don't have enough of a conversation about how serious the climate crisis already is. And so again, emphasizing this point, that climate justice reminds us of the most serious root causes of climate crisis. And that's why, even if you only care about solving climate crisis, we should all be part of the conversation on justice, because that will make climate action more effective, because that will make climate action will have a wider reach and a wider influence within society, because a majority of the world's people have not caused the climate crisis, but they are already being affected. And so if you are a young climate activist, please get into debates and discussions on society, economics, and politics. Without understanding social dynamics, questions of caste, gender, intersectional injustices, as well as the way in which our economic system has been captured by a very small slice of elites everywhere, and the way in which politics has facilitated those elite captures. And those elite captures will not be solved by anarchist politics. It will be solved by engaging in hard public policy work, forcing the governments to reintroduce a new kind of tax system, forcing a government to punish the polluters, and forcing the world community to punish the offenders of human rights and environmental rights. Because you see how some arrogant nearly, people who don't seem to have human sensibilities at the heart of their thinking and speaking, they are being awarded by UNDP Environmentalist of the Year award or something. How does that happen, right? And it's our responsibility to actually fight against that global community, which sort of creates these kinds of hypocritic outcomes, where people who are really responsible for deaths of tens of thousands of people are being awarded and are being lauded in international community. This is completely unacceptable. So thanks again, and I'm sorry if I went on a bit longer, but I wanted to sort of just put all of these things together. And thanks again for organizing this.
Yeah, thank you so much for speaking. I mean, all of you. I think I wish this could just I could listen to like so much more. But yeah, I just like to ask Vaishnavi or whoever's here if there are any questions, we can perhaps open the floor to that. But maybe while we wait for the questions to come from YouTube to hear, Chaitanya, you kind of mentioned you want to talk about sanitation workers. You can perhaps do that right now as we wait.
Okay, thank you for this thing. Actually, Prakash sir has rightly mentioned it also. I just have some specific numbers that I wanted to talk regarding vulnerable communities and how their plight is. So all these numbers you can find in the respective studies that I might share later on. So in India only, as I said that these many laws are there, like around 10 articles, and also a part 4, which is directive principle of state policy, where the environmental protection policies and directives are placed, right, are dealing with the environmental protection, also the social protection of the vulnerable communities per se, right. But the problem here in current situation is the implementation of this law. Like our constitution was made in 1952 at that time. So it's been almost around 60 or 70 years that has been happening, and the implementation as we are yet failed. So regarding this thing, I just talked the plight of the Dalit community per se, but there are various other community and other issues that are raised due to climate crisis. So these are like first thing would be the landlessness that is happening. Like I said, the Dalit community has always been kept denied of the natural resources. So 58.4% of rural Dalits are landless in India. And although being 71% of them constitutionally into the sector, or we can say a community of agriculture workers. So out of 71%, out of the 100%, there are 71% agriculture labor, which are Dalits, and out of which 58% are landless. So this is a striking number to notice how those access to land as a resource, as a common property resource, is undertaken. And also, Prakash sir, I got into this number crunching because Prakash sir has mentioned that the sanitation workers. So in the central government jobs that are there for sanitation workers, 65.57% of the Group D workers are from the scheduled caste community. So this is another statistic. And also, when we talk about vulnerabilities about climate crisis, let's talk about the vulnerability of not having home per se, to shelter to live in. So the slum dwelling population of India amounts to 65.4 million in total, out of which 13.4 million are coming from scheduled caste and 2.2 million are coming from scheduled tribes. And this is just a scenario, and there is this stark demarcation that has been made that most of the misplaced communities are from scheduled tribes and scheduled castes. And when we talk about displaced population, developmental projects, forest making and conservation, or any of those projects that government, 73% of the total population that has been displaced by the various government or anything projects that has been undertaken in India is yet to be rehabilitated. So these are the people. So when we talk about climate crisis and the other factors that come with this, the other effects like displacement, livelihood issues. So these are some numbers that I wanted to just present to the panel and the audience here to give you a sense of how vulnerable these communities are and what is the actual numbers in when we talk about data and all. Being a climate change advocate from TISS, we are always told to go with the data and all. Previously, I was a Greenpeace volunteer and activist, so there we are termed as environmentalist person. So I just wanted to throw out some data in the air when we talk about environmental movement, that environmentalists don't go with the data, and this is the data that we found out to work on this thing. National Council of Human Development and also NCDHR, their work on Dalit rights and human rights. They have presented a paper in 2013 which talks about the problems of the community that face in disasters. So that I think that report was in 2013, I guess. So that report is there, and there is an excellent piece of article by Bhimraj M. That was in last year in 2020, which talks about a Dalit critic of environmental justice. So if you can find this article, it would be really helpful. Apart from that, I think, yeah, let's see how many questions are coming. Disha wants to go next.
Yeah. Sorry. I just wanted to, I think also Dr. Prakash has also been raising his hand. Maybe he can go first. Or if you want to add something directly to this, maybe Disha wants to go ahead.
Yeah, Disha, please go ahead.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Sorry, I didn't see you raising your hand. What I wanted to add was that I was also reading about displacement and how people are displaced by, say, big dams that have been happening rampantly across the country. And there are no laws in India that currently govern the internally displaced people because of big projects. And I was very surprised to hear that. And so we will never fully know the amount of people who have been displaced because they aren't doing surveys on this. They aren't collecting data. So how are we supposed to, like you said, Chaitanya, as environmentalists, how are we supposed to present facts when there isn't initiative taken by the government to conduct surveys to analyze these facts or to even gather these facts? And I think that's really concerning to me. Yeah.
I can talk about that. Let's say what is Prakash sir has to say, then we'll talk about that.
So, yeah, I mean, let's bring in the questions if we already are receiving some questions. But in the meanwhile, I can quickly add a couple of points about the whole Adivasi question. This is a particularly complex topic because of the question of land rights is very central to Adivasi lives and life worlds. On the other hand, Adivasi culture also teaches us sort of ways in which we can live alongside nature. But the way in which this idea that, Adivasis have the wisdom and experiences that can sort of, help us understand our current crisis has been exploited in some ways. And I say exploited because, there's a whole literature on the problem of noble savages, right? So you sort of paint Adivasis as, quote unquote, primitive. They live with nature. You listen to many sort of discussions of Adivasis and you will not hear a word called agriculture in those discussions. This is an old tradition in our country where Adivasis were thought to be living in forest areas. And so, terminology such as forest dwellers or even forest dependent people that I've been using many times in my research and writings, it sort of paints a picture as if, they sort of go out in the forest, pluck some fruits and kill some animals, and that's how they live, right? So, and this is what I meant when I said we need to rethink our vocabulary. As long as we keep painting Adivasis as, these people living in nature, even though it is with the good intention, right? The intention may be that, look, there's a way to coexist with nature. That's great. And in fact, this is true. I mean, all throughout the world, if you look at the biodiversity rich areas, those areas are where Adivasis and indigenous people live, right? But that doesn't mean that our problems that we have caused through our consumption, energy intensive lifestyles, Those problems will not be solved by celebrating Adivasi culture. The question is, can we adopt that culture? Can we get rid of the asphalt and the concrete and the exploitative structures that we are part of, that we all benefit from? And can we rethink our lifestyles? On the other hand, there are global conservation groups who have been singing the song of, we respect the Adivasi rights, but day in and day out, they've been implicated in the violation of human rights. And again, so we need to stigmatize any conservation groups who are involved in human rights violations. I don't care how good your environmental work is. If your environmental work leads to human rights violations, you should be out of business. Simple, right? And so the last point is that these groups who are involved in human rights violations, they have adopted these discourses and narratives because they know that these narratives are popular. And so on their website, you'll see that, they'll start by saying how Adivasis and indigenous people have lived in the forest for generations. And then, you keep reading, and then they'll say that now it's the responsibility of these communities to help global community fight climate change. No, heck no. It's not their responsibility. It's our responsibility to create the space, the development space that Adivasis and other indigenous people need to have roads, hospitals, schools. All of that requires emissions. Let's accept that, right? And this is an old argument that Center for Science and Environment, Anil Agarwal and Sunita Narayan have been making for ages now, that we got to be thinking about climate crisis in conjunction with the question of development. So fundamental development, right? Basic human development services. So we need to be sort of, take out this kind of reliance on the narratives of indigenous people and Adivasis to not talk about our own problems and to change our own lifestyles. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, Adivasi, you can go.
Okay. I just want to quickly come in here to sort of speak about the role of law in these debates, right? So the law has been an instrument of violence when it comes to marginalized communities. And colonial legal frameworks have actually resulted in the exclusion and displacement of these communities. So as much as the law is a site for empowerment, it's equally a site of marginalizing communities further. So as social movements and young climate activists start to engage with the law, it becomes so important to understand that intricacies of how they relate to each other. So the point that Prakash has been making and Chaitanya have been making in terms of Dalit exclusion, although there are legal frameworks which empower these communities, how is it that we can develop sophisticated legal strategies that bring together, say, anti-discrimination laws, say like the Scheduled Caste, Scheduled Tribes Prevention of Atrocities Act, which now has been amended to even include the question of forest rights and alienation of forest land as an atrocity. How do we start to capitalize on that vocabulary? And essentially, the other challenge with issues of, like Prakash was saying, sort of creating this burden to conserve, which gets lopsided, right? And it becomes sort of this whole process where these human rights gains, which have come from this identity framework, then suddenly starts to marginalize them further. Then how can we then reform the law? And that's where and even when we look at economic systems, and environmental law in some sense has to be a space that challenges the existing economic paradigm. How do we use the law to prescribe these alternative ideas and imaginations? And I just want to quickly speak a bit to the Forest Rights Act. And the reason the Forest Rights Act is such an important piece of legislation for climate activists to engage with. It's because it was a product of a social movement translating its idea of justice into a piece of law. So what was that process? Who got left out? And how the law, like I said, continues to create divisions. So as far as the caste question goes, and we look at the Forest Rights Act, what it does is it gives the state the ability to decide who is marginalized. So the idea of a scheduled caste or a scheduled tribe, the state has complete control in decision making. Communities only apply to be recognized. And so it recognizes land rights of the scheduled tribe and then creates another category called the other traditional forest dweller. So the law is good at creating categories, and it tries to manage justice in these categories. And the state decides these categories and shapes these categories. So as we think of new categories, we need to be aware of how they translate into the law and legal frameworks. And so Dalit land rights in forest areas, for example, has been an issue and a source of great marginalization because they've not been able to access the empowering potential of such a progressive law. But we can go into the details of why that happened later, but I'll stop with that.
Yeah, thank you so much, Arpita. Yeah, I think we have a couple of questions now. If Chaitanya, you said you can maybe take up the question that I put in chat. Do you want to go ahead first answering that?
Let me just say before that. Okay. Yeah, how do we enhance so the question is, how do we enhance the resilience capacities of vulnerable social communities? Okay. So I would say that starting to answer this question, that there is no single unilateral way that this can be done. There are plethora of things and processes that needs to be charted out, and it is a collective responsibilities of the public, the society, civic society organization, and the government together to bring out this thing. So I would say that there should be a national program based on community-based disaster risk management, which deals with the vulnerability after the calamities falling. And also there should be a legal policy framework, as Arpita rightly said, that law comes very handy when we talk about crisis or dealing with crisis, or even for any measure that needs to be taken up. So there should be a proper legal policy framework where we can demand the accountability. It's not that the law is not there. There are these many laws that are already in our constitution. There are IPC codes there, and there are many amendments that happen for this protection. But how do we go for the implementation then becomes an active responsibility of civic society organizations per se to take this issue forward, to mobilize it, to voice it out, and then pressurize the government. This is what the best thing civic society organization do, is to mobilize that issue over to an extent that government or the authorities have to act on these terms. The other thing that can be done for enhancing the livelihood is the what we can say, to taken into consideration of their opinions and their views about the climate mitigation process. So that might be very different from what the modern solutions per se, or sustainable solutions that are being provided for say agriculture, right? So prime example for that is Greenpeace had initiated this project called Living Soils in Bihar. So there is in Kedia town in Jamui district, where we have started up this ecological model, where the farmers over there were introduced to all the agriculture policy. Let me tell you, Bihar has many stereotypes under his name, but the agriculture policy of Bihar is superb. I'm coming from Maharashtra, and I can proudly say that. So this policy is, the only problem is to bring those farmers to these policies and to facilitate the process between. These farmers were able to produce yield which was 5 times bigger because their land was totally infertile. And they started by using ecological agriculture methods, means the using the resources which can be found locally over to that area. So that model been set up. That time agriculture minister of Bihar visited that place, and he promised sort of to make an international institute to be done, so that other people and people from other states can, farmers from other states can come and learn. But what actually happened, that village is of Yadav community, and the authority responsible for submitting those files to the government or other agencies, didn't make file because he is from a upper caste community per se. So it's been like 6 years, I guess, 2016, I guess, yeah, 5 years. That file has not been reached, and that dream of having an institute for the first ecological model village of India is still there. So there comes a responsibility of people like us also, or say volunteers like Fridays for Future, the young activists right now, to bring out this issue and then ask the accountability of government. What are you doing? If these are the practices are coming from the community itself, and if there are various measures that can be really helpful across the land, realizing the cutting down the regional barriers, and which are very sustainable per se. So this has to be done. This cohesion and symmetry of information needs to be displaced and disseminated throughout the say government bodies, civic society organization, and the public per se. And here in, I will say, in the community per se, farmers community. So this can be done. And another thing for the resilience is, because resilience always comes into the factor of climate crisis, that the disaster risk reduction programs that they have and the bodies they have and the task force, say NDMA, STMA, DDMA, or these bodies should have community-based or people from the community itself who can talk about their rights and their allocation, so that it becomes an equitable distribution of resources and measures that can be done after the calamity has fallen. So these are some ways that I can formulate my mind right now for the enhancing the resilience of the community. Prakash sir has something to add on it.
Yeah, thank you, Chaitanya, for those very helpful comments. And again, sort of the wearing my academic hat, there's another sort of 10-year-old literature on how the concept of resilience has been misused to, sort of distract attention away from the actions of the rich and wealthy and so forth. So it's important to keep that in mind while we continue to strengthen local communities' resilience. The second thing I would like to sort of add to along the lines of what Chaitanya said is that there is a tremendous amount of experience in the development community, especially those who've been working on natural resources management, working with communities. So, those experiences of how to build local institutions that will allow locally relevant natural resource management that will contribute to community resilience and robustness, there's a great deal of opportunity to learn from that. And again, this is to sort of point out that there's a tendency in the climate conversation to think of climate crisis as a new thing. But when we think about questions of resilience and robustness, all of the prior development experiences of great value, and experience both in terms of the ecological and physical, biophysical processes, but also the experiences about institution building. The third thing that I would say is that, which is sort of specific to India, is that, despite decades of civil society work, we actually don't have a very strong legal framework for civil, political, and human rights. So if you pause for a moment and think about what are the laws that protect the most marginalized Dalit and Adivasi communities, you can think of, the atrocities law. And then the other day I was, doing some of this literature survey, and I found out that the untouchability law is extremely narrowly defined. And again, what's happened with the law that made manual scavenging illegal, and you have state governments and district collectors who are hiding data because they don't want to come under the spotlight of media and all of that. So creation of data sets on things like manual scavenging, about the Dalits employed in municipalities, the below minimum wages payments that they get, the inhuman conditions under which they work, all of this is extremely important for strengthening our ability to make these arguments. So both thinking about the newer laws and starting some advocacy to protect the civil, human rights and political rights, even hate laws, for example. All of these are relevant because we have seen how in the midst of COVID crisis, Muslims and many other communities have been subjected to hate crimes openly, right? I mean, ministers talking rubbish on public media, on public television, and there's no sort of legal recourse that that can be made to any of those. The one small point: the COVID crisis also reminds us the major problem that we have is that of informality of economic system. When the flood, the cloud burst or the glacial lake burst that happened in Uttaranchal, for 4 days, we didn't even know how many people died there because the laborers who were working there, they were subcontracted, and you don't even have a proper record of who was working there. So in our economy, 90% of the people are like that. They work in informal framework. Even if they work for a multinational companies, they are employed through subcontractors who are not keeping them on sort of record or on registers. So again, it's very important to create these kinds of knowledge bases and data sets that will allow us to make these arguments very, very strongly. And then, of course, use all of that to create strong civil society mobilization, as Chaitanya and Arpita pointed out.
Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah, sure. Yeah, there is a couple of questions. Maybe Arpita can, like you said, you want to talk about, and all you can address that. And also, I think there's another thing about the policy exclusion of Dalits in the recent acts and policies like FRA 2008. There's a question about that. Maybe yeah, we can you can answer this, and then we have another question that we can go to later.
Oh yeah, thank you for that question. I think the point that Prakash made, I think Disha made earlier, and Chaitanya has been making, is sort of the absence of the law in addressing some of these issues, right? There isn't any legal recourse. There are a few, and I think I take one for the community of lawyers, in that a lot of these conversations are happening, but within the legal community. And I think it's not been successful in translating and engaging with the non-lawyers, right? And that's something as a community we've been struggling with. But there has been an experiment that has been underway where Professor Tarun Khaitan has drafted India's first anti-discrimination law. And that was based on a lot of survey and data gathering from the ground. And it was designed and tabled by Shashi Tharoor. Unfortunately, was not passed. There's that, one idea that's been kind of looming. The other is what a lot of lawyers sometimes, get rather confused about, is that we sort of throw everything into the supreme law of the Constitution. So the Constitution is going to address all of this, right? And as lawyers, we kind of valorize the Constitution. For us, it's almost, everything. And the spirit of any law is kind of derived from the mother textbook of the Constitution. And when we look at issues of human rights or civil and political rights, it goes into that, dark abyss of constitutional law and jurisprudence. But that is so heavily doctrinal. It's so guarded that nobody can really kind of go into that space and pull out what they need. And so that's been a huge challenge. We do have a very rich constitutional law jurisprudence, but constitutional lawyers, I think, need to come out with maybe like a beginner's guide to the Indian Constitution and cases that you can use. The other point on the question of Dalit exclusion in environmental laws, I think that's it. It's not even a blind spot. It's so crass and so like omnipresent that it's saddening. And one of the things that Chaitanya spoke about was the Mahad Satyagraha. And if you look back at that court judgment where it said that the Hindus have the right to decide on common property resources, it just goes to show how the jurisprudence and legal thinking itself is so casteist, right? So it's like the onion that Prakash was talking about. How do we start to peel it one layer at a time? Um, this is where we need a lot of anti-caste legal interpretations to come into the practice of environmental law. And why do I say that? See, the idea is if you want a new law and you want to amend existing laws, it's a whole long drawn process. We're talking about a 10-year timeline minimum. What's quicker and more logical is we take what we have and we reimagine how we use it. So, can we take the Environment Protection Act, the Forest Rights Act, and read it with the Prevention of Atrocities Act? Let's start creating these micro legal interventions on the ground and these new ways of packaging laws to begin an anti-caste legal strategy. And then from there, build up to a bigger legal project of a legislation. How do we even look at, say, the constitutional provisions of denying access to water, right? It's actually unconstitutional to do that. So can we take that and then implement that in a district where Dalit communities are being denied access to water? So those are some ideas. Okay, the exclusion of Dalits, particularly in the FRA. So one of the reports that I produced was to look at the Dalit question in the context of the Forest Rights Act. And what I discovered was the social movements that were involved in drafting these laws, and eventually the National Advisory Council, which was the key nodal kind of committee that translated this into a piece of legislation, had invited people to come and talk about these issues. And there was only one person who mentioned the word caste. It was completely, shocking that all of this, and in fact, it was even called the tribal bill. And the reason this also happened was rather practical because the Ministry of Tribal Affairs has its jurisdiction and mandate laid out, which is to look at scheduled tribes. Cannot extend its purview into the scheduled caste question. And the interviews that I did with the drafters, very often they'd say Dalits in forest areas? Isn't that more of a plains question? So there was this like hills and plains divide, right? I'm like, what do you mean? And when you interview Dalit communities in forest areas, many have taken refuge to forests because they've gone out of the plains where they faced very, very horrible atrocities and then moved to the hills and started to live in these forest areas. So there's also that particular question. So essentially the answer is, sadly, I would be quite blunt in saying that the movement that was deciding and making these decisions about the law was casteist. It didn't take on the Dalit question seriously. And secondly, the government playing its sort of jurisdictional card ignored this very, very important avenue of marginalization.
Yeah, thank you very much. I'd just like to maybe say the next question and open it to whoever wants to take it up. And also, Dr. Prakash kind of talked about he wanted to also answer pitch in on the FRA question. Yeah, so the question is, how do we come to know? Okay, question is, how do we come to know the damage done by corporate giants as it is not visible, as they consume resources that people use, and yeah, how do we sort of come to know this and hold them accountable by law? And because these people pretend to care when they're culprits. This is the kind of question that has been asked. Yeah.
Thank you. That's whoever asked that question. That's a great question, and I'll let Disha handle that. Each of us can certainly add to that. I just wanted to add and sort of conclude the discussion about FRA that Arpita mentioned so nicely. I mean, that's one example. Remember, the drafter of the Forest Rights Acts are some of the most inspiring activists and scholars in our country, right? So, but even they were blindsided by these kinds of dichotomy between forest and plains and Dalits and the Adivasis, right? So this just goes to say what I was saying about, we sometimes don't realize how deeply ingrained in our thinking and our academia is the different kinds of understandings of the social world that we partially live in, but we are still blind to, right? And so if, I was thinking afterwards that maybe some of my earlier comments about what the young climate activists should be doing, maybe they came across as being a bit preaching or whatever. But what I wanted to say is that it's extremely complicated, and the more we dig deeper into these questions, the more we will understand. The other point I want to sort of add here to take this opportunity is that if you ever find yourself talking derogatorily about identity politics, please do a privilege check. One, it's extremely complex. And of course, there are, like everything, there are bad sides to quote unquote identity politics. But we don't realize how much identity politics has actually contributed indirectly, less directly and more indirectly, to social reforms and to raising awareness and to the laws and so forth. For example, the other forest dependent people, forest dwelling peoples clause in the Forest Rights Act was added because of the RJD and other political parties advocating for these other groups. And surely they were motivated by electoral considerations. But that's what democracy is supposed to be about, right? In democracy, leaders and political parties care about different constituencies because they are voters. So, and again, some of these discourses that we see sometimes in environmental community and climate community, that it's all about vote bank politics and elections. Elections is not a bad thing. You know how valuable elections are only when elections are stolen, right? Or when election produces an, ignoramus um, um, who makes light of the humanity that 1.4 billion people represent. So our democracy is an extremely important part of this, and the reason it doesn't function well is because those who benefit from the status quo, they are not letting it function. So Forest Rights Act, despite the inclusion of other forest dwelling communities in the law, the Forest Department and some of the state agencies and officials, they ignored that part deliberately. And I have evidence from Mandla and other places where I was doing research where systematically the other forest dwelling part was marginalized because they simply they wanted to minimize the amount of land rights that were recognized. So, because it was so difficult to do for Adivasis, they targeted other forest dwelling communities to sort of take away the rights from. And similarly, we know how the collective forest rights were completely undermined by the Forest Department. Now, again, this is the last bit I'll say. If you think Forest Department and many of these environmentalists who talk about exclusionary wildlife protection like national park, if you think they are interested in environmental conservation, you would have expected them going around the country and saying, look, Forest Rights Act has this great collective forest rights provision, which prevents forests from going out of the purview of collective forest rights, and which would contribute to protection of forest. But tell me, did you see Forest Department officials going around the country and talking? I know I have collected evidence on this. Forest Department officials worked really hard to completely undermine the collective rights part of the Forest Rights Act. And again, because Forest Department is the biggest landlord in our country, which controls 22.5% of the land, their interest is solely in being the landlord. Their interest is not actually promoting effective forest and wildlife conservation. And this is all based on evidence, right? So these dichotomies that are sometimes created between social justice and environmental protection, they don't stand to the evidence. They don't stand empirical scrutiny. And I think it's really important to bring those kinds of evidences into our discussions. And over to Dishana.
Just to answer the question on how to identify if industries are polluting, I think it really depends on the projects, because sometimes, obviously, all industries greenwash you into believing that whatever they're doing is good for the planet. But a lot of times, if they're starting on a new project, they have to provide an EIA. Because I know the draft EIA dilutes a lot of these provisions, but at least since it hasn't been passed yet, with the existing EIA, they do have to conduct it. And although a lot of times it has been proven that it is biased, and they don't show the full picture because it is funded by them. So obviously they do want to get the clearances to continue polluting. A lot of times what has come to the rescue is citizen science. And one such example is the Chennai campaign we ran on Pulicat. And I believe they came out with an EIA saying that there were less than like 60 species of birds in Pulicat, when that was not the case. There were, and citizen science websites and data showed that there were more than 200 species of birds that were spotted in that particular area. So in the case where they had filed against Vedanta, I believe, the citizen science really helped them. So what is important is to understand that although there will be data provided by the organization itself, don't take it at face value, because it's probably funded by themselves and they're not going to do us any favors by showcasing actual facts. So citizen science has been very, very effective in showcasing the actual data, because it's a people's collective coming in, putting together data. They aren't funded by anyone. Most of them aren't getting paid for it. So rely on citizen science evidence that will showcase what the actual industry is doing, because that's probably the most accurate figures you can get to. I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, I just want to add into the Chennai question, where Vetiver Collective, which kind of like also was part of kind of creating this data, like they've empowered like local fisher communities to create their own maps to kind of, dominate, to counter the hegemony of maps that, the state creates, so that they are able to show that their activities are also there on the lake and they exist on their activities happen. So I guess, yeah, citizen science, and as Dr. Prakash was also talking about how we should have, like, we don't have data about a lot of things we want to make a case for. So I think, yeah, these kind of initiatives are definitely important. I think Chaitanya wanted to answer this question as well, so I'll pass it on to him.
Yeah, so it was more about to talk what Disha has asked earlier, that how to measure, the quantify the displaced people and their plight, right? If you want to put it in statistical forms. And this also, I think it's connected to what you are just speaking right now, on the very point that how to collectivize this data and present. So there is this amazing process that has started something, I think 5 or 6 years back, which is called as social audit. So social audit for the government projects or any environmental projects that's been happening, how its impact on various factors, socially, economically, and also per se physically on the communities that are impacted through that project is been done. Right now, as far as my knowledge goes, the social audit thing is going in Andhra Pradesh, Telangana, Karnataka, Jharkhand. In this state, it is currently actively going, and they have superb results by social audit system. So social audit can be a one tool that we can use for identification of such communities and the impact that has been happening, say positive or negative, by the projects that are happening. Another thing that I would like to mention, and it is very crucial personally to me also, is the caste-wise census, socio-economic census that has been demanded by anti-caste movement since, I don't know what, before my birth, I guess. So that is more useful per se, where we got to know let me, before continuing that, let me give you a context to this thing. So in our masters, we had this vulnerability study and research that we need to do for the community to check how they stand on resilience, what is vulnerability on. So we have these surveys going up, which constitute a lot of questions about what are the livestock they have, what are the resources they have, what is the access to the natural resources they have, and what are the government schemes and process, and what are the earnings. So all these economical, political and environmental aspects that has been covered in that series. So when we talk about this caste-based economic census for India, it will cover three factors. First, the economic vulnerability of people according to their social location, which is very crucial in coming days when we are talking about the policy change that needs to be done around at national level. Second, this thing, census, when we talk about it, also quantify or noted down the people's migrations per se and the reason to migration. So very specific to Disha's question, this would be very helpful to quantify this data of people's displacement and their migration related to projects that have happened and the displacement of the people that happened due to the projects. And the third thing, which is very personal, as I earlier had said, that the whole thing that my activism revolves around about social justice is to annihilate caste. And the whole ongoing, we can say, a social paradigm of the anti-caste movement is to bring forth the data about the economic stability and vulnerability of various marginalized groups, and accordingly the reservation issue regarding that. So all these 3 points can be covered by a caste-wise census that we might be having. I don't know what is the current status of 2021 status. They have accepted the request or not. It is still ongoing battle, and I don't know if it will be happening or not. But the demand for this census would be a really great thing to quantify the data, and the data is public, right? The caste census, the census data is public, like 2011 data and all, and forming a policy regarding that, and even for us to start and jot down our movement to propagate this movement regarding this data set would be really helpful. So these are the two tools or methods I think that we can use for basing and then planning our movements henceforth.
Thank you, Chaitanya. Dr. Prakash, you can answer about the Bill Gates question.
Right. So the question is, I'll read for the audience. It's addition to the recent question they asked, like Bill Gates dominates the world for like 10 years, and then he just pretends to be a monk and and creates Gates Foundation. But what about the inequality, as 20% resources are held by the top 100 people, and these are 100 individuals. So the level of economic wealth and social inequality in the world is unfathomable. Even in a society here like US, where you have very high levels of education and data and media, a majority of US's population thinks that they're middle class. In fact, US middle class has been shrinking, and now a smaller portion of US population is middle class. So the perception of inequality, it underestimates the inequality even by people who are affected by inequality, right? So forget about thinking about poor people and all of that. Even middle class doesn't have a good idea of how seriously unequal today's world is. And again, there's a lot of problem in international data comparisons. But there are, some research that shows that India is among one of the most unequal countries in the world. And it's been rising, as you know. The inequality in India has been going up steadily since the early 2000s. In the context of climate crisis, what people like Bill Gates do is to sort of, exploit their privileges to come up with simplistic technocratic solutions that fit their vision of the world. And sometimes, unfortunately, even climate movements sort of accept these kinds of ideas without much questioning and critical thinking. For example, recent times, there's been a lot of discussion of net zero, right? There's been a lot of discussion of nature-based solutions. Now, what is nature-based solution? It's going back to, valorization of indigenous communities and their effort to protect forest. Nature-based solution says that rich people will invest in conserving nature. And it includes offsets, which, as all of you know, actually allow the rich and the wealthy to continue emitting while they can pay pittance for forest protection in places like India or Tanzania or other places. Now, even if that pittance, now see how layered this discussion is. I would argue that even if that pittance coming from global north or industrialized countries was actually transferred to the local communities, it would be actually a significant amount compared to what they are earning right now. But the horror of our corrupt and completely amoral system is that even that pittance is eaten up by people who are already fat and elite. Right? So, I mean, it's really difficult to see where you start talking about the question of social justice in this entire chain of global climate crisis and responses to climate crisis. So yes, nature-based solutions, great. Bring all the money to Dantewada and Jharkhand and Mandala. Mandala is my favorite place actually, and then invest in Adivasi communities, right? Then you will say that okay, I've done something for the marginalized. But to use these slogans simply as this kind of abstraction that and then forget about whether any money has come or not is actually a bit irresponsible, because what it does is that it legitimizes the technocratic optimism that people like Bill Gates promote without making sure that if there's something good in that, that's actually realized in practice. Right? So, but as a matter of rule, I think we should always be wary of letting these spaces be dominated by the vocabulary and the discourses that have been spun by the elite and the wealthy and the privileged people anywhere in the world. So thank you for that really wonderful question.
Yeah, I think both Chaitanya and Arpita would like to add to this. So,
Sure.
yeah.
Thanks,
Yeah.
Chaitanya. So I just wanted to sort of quickly add to this in terms of how the intellectual property regime gets harnessed in these contexts, right? When we looked at Bill Gates, and the Bill Gates Foundation really sponsoring research on vaccines, essentially it came with a baggage of patents. And similarly too with the technocratic solutions for climate change. It's going to be monetized. It's going to become another sort of market-oriented solution supported by a neoliberal legal framework, which excludes poor communities and poor countries.
If I can quickly interject, they not only came up with all these patented vaccines, but when Oxford University actually tried to make it open access, they fought it. That is basically a crime against humanity, and it's on public record, right? So let's take all this halo of the philanthropists doing the good bid, and they're doing all that they can do, all of that. So I think we need to delegitimize their moral standing in these kinds of discussions and discourses.
Yeah, you can still speak though, Chaitanya.
Yeah, I
guess
can
he has a
speak.
power. Yeah. Okay.
But Arpita wanted to continue, I guess.
No. I just stopped with my rant of the horrific patent regime.
Okay. So this is what actually has Disha also has raised in previous earlier conversation that we are having, that, and also the question that has been raised, that how companies are getting away with whatever the damage they do with it. So the framework that also the regulation body per se in India that they have right now, that they are working on a principle of polluter pay principle. I think that is the case with the other countries, developing countries and developed countries also. But this principle, in fact, is very problematic, since it is just a license to damage the environment by compensating with the monetary value, giving it. It might be a great thing to have generating revenue for the state bodies or governments, but then it's just that there was this movie of James Bond, I guess, License to Kill. So I would go and take into the account of that thing only. It is just a license to damage the environment, and in compensation saying that, okay, I can throw thousands of chunks of monies to your account and just let me do it the thing. And on account of that also, we can actually measure how much damage these people are doing. Like Disha has rightly said that they will be having this various projects and reports that they might be publishing for their own CSR activities. But actually how much fine they are paying is one way of finding out how much damage they are doing in terms of carbon emissions or say ecological destruction. And sorry, the main point that I wanted to raise here is that we took this discussion too far into centric mode margin and other communities, and I totally forgot to mention and talk about the plight of the queer people and person with disabilities when we talk about intersectionality also here. So Daphne is good friend of Disha. Disha can add on to this, but Daphne's campaign that I like most about is about her calling out the ban the straw movement, and which is actually an ableist idea because most of the people with disabilities can't work around with the normal process of eating and drinking of food or for sustenance. So when we talk about banning the one-time use plastic, single-use plastic, or banning the straw, it actually affects the person with disabilities later. And in that sense, it's not a sustainable solution or what we can say an answer for the plastic pollution that may be having. The movement garnered lots of support by corporates, civil society organizations, individuals alike. But then these are the basic things that we should also incorporate and think on in our various strategies or campaigns or works that we do. That these are the things, whatever the actions we are doing, how can we incorporate the communities and what is the effect that they are having through these actions. So this might be a way to take forward our discussion forward. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah, I think we'll have to close this as well. So maybe Disha can add a comment, and if anyone else would like to add anything, we can do that, and then we can, end this. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you, Chaitanya, for highlighting that. I completely agree. Like, I think a lot of environmentalism that we were taught and that we started out with was ableist, because I know personally I've promoted like ban the straw campaigns earlier on in my life, and it took me a while to understand that why it's not okay and why it's not a sustainable solution, because it excludes a whole category of people, and we can't have solutions like that. And it's actually kind of similar to vegans. Okay, I'm vegan, but I'm not upper caste. But you know how upper caste vegans come in and say Adivasi should go vegan, or Dalits or particular categories of people should go vegan, which is really insensitive sometimes, and they put it across in very degrading terms. And I feel like that at the end of the day, it is pushing Brahminical purity and their Brahminical vegetarianism on everyone else. It's just, reformed itself to like veganism. This isn't to say that there aren't Dalit Bahujan vegans, and obviously there are, and they do great work. But a lot of discourse is just taken by upper caste vegans. So if there is a climate solution, it has to be inclusive. Otherwise, it's not going to solve a problem. It's just going to enable discomfort to a particular category. And that's not, I don't think that's climate justice.
Yeah.
Yeah, I purposely didn't spoke out about veganism as a sustainable option for climate crisis because I have tried to be vegan and also I know the process is there, but then innately I didn't support it, the idea, because coming from marginalized community and the sustenance value per se, that when we talk about food value and life cycle assessment that these people do for the meat, I think if we can do the life cycle assessment of a per se plants per se in terms of the deforestation that happens for the agriculture, it has a historical perspective also. and a responsibility, like how we talk about the global north has historical responsibility for the emissions. So all these technical factors come in, and I just don't want to get involved in that debate at all, because uh, 7 years I tried discuss debate, and I just don't want to deal any of that stuff anymore. I just want to do that. If you give me the correct data and all, I can change my views. You just give me the correct data, factual data,
No,
and we
I
can
really
talk.
don't have to post.
So that's why I purposefully
Yeah,
ignored that debate.
I understand where you're coming from.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, okay. So with that, probably we should, I thought this was going to be 1 hour, but like, the conversation is so interesting that, this has gone on for like almost 2 hours. But thank you so much, everyone. This has been really inspiring and really, a really valuable talk, I think. And I'd like to thank Archana, Sarang, and Ruhi for kind of connecting us with these panelists. And I'd love to like continue to follow your work. With that, I thank everyone who stayed and listened, and I thank the panelists once again for their valuable insights. We can end this now. See you guys. Thank you. Bye.